Standing.
So we know the party's starting next door, and this is a very tight timeline, so we're going to be covering a lot of things in about 25 minutes, and then we'll have 20 minutes or so for questions. But so that we're able to frame our conversation, we were wondering who is in the audience right now. How many people are artists?
Good.
Okay, so kind of
Good.
a lot, actually.
Good.
And are there labels, independent labels, major, independent, publishers?
Publishers.
Okay, a
Okay.
lot. Lawyers
Lawyer.
and other companies in the music industry. Okay.
Others. Okay.
Forgetting? I think
No, that works.
artists, we can
I feel loud. Am I loud? Anyway.
too loud.
No, that works.
So we're
feedback.
going to be talking about some considerations that you'll need to take into account when doing business with the U.S. So
Yeah.
dealing with U.S. attorneys, immigration considerations, and certain insurance issues that may come up. Some contractual standards and clauses to look out for when dealing with agreements in the U.S., and also discussing the revenue streams and how to collect your money from U.S. exploitation of your
Or
works.
not collect.
And not collect a ton.
Or collect just that much. Yeah.
So, I mean, the most important thing whenever you're dealing with any transaction in the U.S. Is to make sure that you have proper representation. And that's in picking the right attorney. And in the U.S., I think very similar to Brazil, law firms range in size from solo practice to boutique firms. The majority of entertainment firms I've found are small and boutique. And then there's also larger firms with thousands of attorneys. But the most important thing is that the attorney that you work with is very specialized in the area that you're dealing with, because a lot of attorneys that don't necessarily work in entertainment, probably similar to Brazil, aren't familiar with the nuances of working in the music industry, particularly with respect to the various revenue streams, royalty collection, understanding what's happening on the digital frontier right now, advances with YouTube and other audiovisual exploitations online. So it's really important to work with someone that is very experienced in it. Similarly, if you're dealing with immigration issues or tax issues or securities laws, which is dealing with stock or investment in companies, you want to make sure that your representation is experienced and specialized in those areas. And something to keep in mind is that your local counsel in Brazil can work closely with an attorney in the US so that you have the best representation on both sides, so that Brazilian laws and standards are being communicated to you, so you understand the differences, and also that your interests are being properly represented in America. And especially for the artists, I'm going to quickly talk about some fees when working with attorneys in the US. Similar to, I think, in Brazil, but to know that it is all negotiable. Fees for attorneys are often hourly or by time, but they're frequently flat fee rates or retainer rates or commission on the deal that you're doing, which usually is around 5%, just to get into some specific numbers.
Do it.
So that's, yeah?
Well, I mean, fee arrangements can be.
Like alternative fee structures?
Yeah.
Yeah, so dealing with flat fees and negotiating it, that you can make sure that whatever you need is covered in that, and you can have caps, so you know that it won't exceed a certain point, or minimums and caps. There's a lot of flexibility right now in dealing with fees with attorneys in the US, so make sure to have that conversation and don't necessarily take the first format that's being offered to you, because you want to make sure that it works for your situation and your budget.
Yeah. As much as our lawyer friends hate that,
I know.
know that you can negotiate with your lawyer, and feel free to say, this is what my budget is, and this is what I can handle, and can we come up with an alternative fee arrangement or a payment plan, because things can get expensive. So,
Yes, very quickly.
did you want to have me dive into?
Yeah, I think you can get into
Where are we
some
at
of the
then?
immigration
Yeah.
and
Okay.
insurance issues.
So yeah, my two I's, insurance and immigration. If you're trying to do business in the United States, I'm going to kind of take it from the point of view of if you're an artist and a manager of an artist. Let's look at it that way first. If you're going over to the United States to tour, you're going to be required, or you should, carry insurance. And there's a variety of insurance packages. Some might be packages or insurance that you have here. Some might be a little bit new and different, because the United States is a very litigious society. There's just people suing people all the time. And therefore, it's very important to kind of carry all the different insurance packages. So I'll just give you a quick list of some of them, and then if you have questions later, you can ask. But there's general liability, which is an insurance package that covers, or a policy that covers for sort of your negligence. There's a whole long list of things, but it's generally if you're sued for your practices and your general, somebody, for example, slips and falls during your show, for example, it could be that the general liability policy would cover for a lawsuit that may ensue from that. Your property insurance, very important for your equipment and your musical instruments. You want to have that when you're traveling, so it's pretty important to cover that. Workers' comp, that you may talk about later, but if you have roadies, people who are helping you, dancers, as part of your concert, they may be considered employees possibly, and Jennifer may touch on that a little later, but that may require you to carry workers' compensation insurance in the United States. It's quite unique to the United States, actually. E&O insurance, which is errors and omissions insurance, which is the policy, it's really a professional liability policy. It's basically if you make a mistake in the line of your work. One of the big areas of that is that it covers for copyright infringement. And so a lot of times that's when it comes into use, is if somehow you infringed on somebody's copyright while you're doing your work in the United States, your E&O insurance would cover that. You also have auto liability for hired and non-hired autos, important when you have production vans and vehicles and what have you for doing your tour. Often people carry an umbrella policy, which is a $1 million, $5 million, or $10 million policy that sits on top of these other policies, depending how it's written, in case you think that you're really working, you're doing a big show or a big tour, and there might be some big liability, some big money tickets, and you want to have extra protection. A lot of people buy the umbrella policy. There's also event cancellation insurance. If you're not just going as an artist, but you're also, say, the promoter behind it, where you stand to lose some invested money if that show was canceled for some reason, you might want to look into carrying event cancellation insurance. And health insurance. A lot of times your domestic health policies don't cover you for medical issues that may come up abroad, so you want to make sure when you're in the United States that does not have any government, not really any government health care, you want to carry an American health care policy. And and then there's another thing, which is third-party property damage. If in the line of your work you somehow spoil somebody's dress or damage their instruments, like the other band that's playing instruments, you would want to have third-party property coverage. So I just wanted to mention that on the insurance side. Immigration, the other I, important to have. I just want to say a few things about immigration because it gets very technical, very complicated. I often suggest hiring an immigration attorney in the United States to do your immigration paperwork. But as artists, as people who manage artists, as people who may help want to do work in the United States, I just want to mention a couple of things. Number one, it's so important to start early. Do at least a 6 months out process. If you're thinking you're going to be doing business in the United States and you're going to be working, if you're just going for a meeting and something that feels or looks like a meeting, you probably don't need anything other than a business visa. But if you're going and getting paid by a U.S. entity for your work that is performed in the United States, you were most probably going to need what they call a temporary non-immigrant visa. And it really is important to try to start 6 months out and gathering the documents, having the U.S. entity file a petition on your behalf to get you a particular type of visa that fits into the type of work that you're doing. So important to start ahead of time. I mean, there are ways to pay expedited fees, an extra $1,000 or $1,200, whatever it costs now, to get something expedited where they say it'll take about a month. It usually takes more like 6 to 8 weeks. Make sure that you've done that. And just to mention a couple of the typical visas, there are categories in the United States, like with letters, an A, B, C, D, E type of visas. There's one called an O visa and one called a P visa, which are the typical ones that people in the entertainment industry use. An O1 visa is for someone who's extraordinary in the arts. And you only get that visa, and it can be good for up to 3 years and renewable, but you only get it if you can really show that you're extraordinary. And that means you should start now if you're thinking about going in 5 years and gather bloggers and press material and letters, a relationship with the cultural attaché, and getting folks to write letters and show press materials that show that you are one of the best at what you do. And it doesn't have to be as a performer. It can be that you're the best arts manager, the best arts administrator, the best label head, but you have to be able to show that you're the best in your area of entertainment. And so it's important to just think of that in the back of your mind as you're sort of building your businesses or building your careers, and you think you may want to be going to the United States and possibly stay there or tour there for a while. Another area is called a there's a P1 and a P3 visa, but basically it's for groups or individuals who are culturally unique. So if you have an art form that you're doing where you are really bringing your culture, your tradition, traditional Brazilian or samba music, for example, to the United States, it's much easier to get a visa that way than it is if you're doing something that is not as culturally identifiable, almost always because the language that you're going to sing in is probably Portuguese. You will have a very easy time getting a P1 or a P3 visa. P1 is for a group, P3 is for an individual. But so think about that as the way that you can identify yourself to the US government, but you have to have a US sponsor you. So there's so much more to say about that, but because of time, I'm gonna just breeze over that. Just to say that, again, working with attorneys in the US, if you have an immigration attorney, it can get expensive. There are immigration visa services in the United States, ones that are very specific to the music industry, one called TCG, Traffic Control Group, another called Tamistad, that a lot of the foreign performers who want to tour in the United States use, who are not attorneys, but they've been doing this now for years and understand how to do the paperwork and get things going. But again, they probably won't work with you if you don't come to them about 6 months in advance, unless you want to pay them expedited fees. Done on that.
Excellent.
Okay.
We are covering a lot. I'm going to talk a little bit about different contracts and legal relationships in the U.S. and Nita's touched on a couple of them. But obviously there's so many different types of music industry contracts, so I'm not going to be able to talk about all of them specifically, but if you do have specific questions at the end, I can address them. But Nita's brought up a couple points in her discussion of immigration dealing with the relationship with the parties that you're contracting with. So if you're going on tour and you're hiring a dancer, there's a question as to whether they're an independent contractor or whether they're an employee. And there are different insurance implications, there are different tax implications, and really what it comes down to is a greater inquiry than just a contract. But a contract can be a good indicator of what the relationship is. And with an independent contractor, which is in most cases, unless they're truly an employee, where you're directing exactly what they do and they work at your premises and you're giving them equipment, usually in the examples we've been using, they would be a contractor. Mm-hmm. But you need to have an agreement with them because what they create for you, particularly if it's in the design or creative world, isn't owned by you. Similar to, I think, in Brazilian law, you need to make sure that there is a work for hire provision in that agreement so that when you're engaging someone to do certain work for you, that you own the results and proceeds of it. And it's very clear what the services are. And we touched on employment also. Something else to think about is when you're working with companies, is actually, you may say, oh, I'm partners with this great label in the US. You're probably not partners. It's very, very rare that you will actually enter into a partnership agreement. And if you do, and your lawyer will tell you there's some red flags with that, because if you're a partner in the legal sense, you're liable, so you're responsible for all of the liabilities and debts of the partnership equally with everyone and fully personally. So if Nita and I are partners and I go and charge $1,000 to our partnership, I have no money, let's say, and Nita would be fully responsible for it. To get around some of these legal issues with partnerships, usually you enter into independent contractor agreements or joint ventures. So it's just something to be aware of. You also don't want to create agencies. So an agent, and I'll talk a little bit about music agents, but an agent has the right to engage, to commit you to certain legal obligations. So whenever you see agency or power of attorney where someone can enter into contracts on your behalf, I mean, your lawyer will work with you on it, but there are red flags and there are things to be aware of because you're giving rights that someone else can enter you into certain agreements. So quickly, I do want to talk very generally, give you some numbers about typical music industry contracts in the U.S. So I mentioned earlier that lawyers often will take a 5%. If it's a commission-based deal, they'll take a 5% commission. Label deals vary widely. Major label deals in recent years, they still have a 12 to 15% royalty rate for the artist, of which you're paying your producers out of your 15%. You're paying 3, maybe 4% if they're a big name producer, to a producer out of your royalty rate.
A studio producer,
music producer. And a remix producer maybe gets a percent also. But major labels also, as I'm sure many of you know or are familiar with, they're now entering into what are called 360 deals, where they take a percentage of a lot of your ancillary revenue and ancillary rights as well, meaning they want co-publishing, they want a percentage of your merchandise, they want a percentage of your touring revenue in connection with albums under that agreement. And really, you don't want to you want to keep all of your rights at least uncrossed, so you have separate revenue streams, but you want to keep them for yourself because a lot of times labels will expect a lot of rights. They may want publishing, but they may actually not be equipped to offer you services that a traditional publishing company would. So you're better able to monetize your assets if you keep things separate. Indie labels, however, are entering into a lot of different types of deals, moving away from these traditional royalty structures. So what's very common is it's a percentage of net receipts. You divide up net revenue almost like a joint venture. So you split it 50-50 and you basically say, like, we're partners, not in the legal sense, but we're in this together. Maybe the advances are lower. There's less money up front than a major label, but you take 50% of the net revenue home at the end of the day. Net, yes, which I will talk about. So, I mean, and this comes up with both major label and independent label agreements. You want to be very careful to be sure of what you're getting paid out of, what pool of money. Because if a label is giving you money for touring, a touring advance, a recording advance, marketing expenses, manufacturing, if they're shooting a music video and you find that they're taking you out to dinner every week with 20 people, that might be a recoupable expense that they get to first make back before you see anything. So it's always very important to carve out line items of what is recoupable, what are expenses, what is that definition of net revenue. So at the end of the day, you do get a check, and your check is on the same terms with the indie deals. If it's 50-50, at the end of the day, they should be, maybe they're out-of-pocket actual costs they should recoup, but you, as an artist, want to limit it, so it's very clear what they're spending and what they're not, or what they're not able to recoup first. Another few other agreements is I want to talk about manager agreements in the U.S. And particularly managers versus agents. And this is important to know if you are a manager in Brazil operating in the U.S. or if you plan on starting a subsidiary company in the U.S. Managers and agents are regulated very differently, and in most states. And I will say that the U.S. Each state has a different law, and then there's also federal law, similar to my understanding of how it is here. So copyright and trademark and intellectual property is generally governed by federal laws, although there are also state laws. But contract laws, employment laws, those are state by state. So you should always be careful to see what law is applicable, what state law is applicable to your agreement. New York and California are the most common because those are where the big entertainment industries are, and there's a lot of robust case law around it. So agents are at least New York and California, are very heavily regulated by the state. They're like employment agencies, like any other employment agency. So there are restrictions to what kind of commissions they can take. They have to be registered. A manager cannot act as an agent, and if he's not registered, he or she are not registered. So if your manager says, I'm going to book you shows and I will get you tours. You shouldn't listen to them, you shouldn't rely on that, and actually if you are a manager, be very careful because there's, a lot of cases where managers lose their commissions after the fact because they were operating as an agent. So manager fees, though, just to go through some numbers very quickly.
Numbers, do it.
15, 20, maybe 25%, you'll see depending on the notoriety of the and the manager, how much money the artist is bringing in will affect what the manager's commission is. I talked about producers, I talked about labels, agents, 5 to 10%, business managers, 5%, or agents can be even more actually.
Yeah.
Distribution companies vary widely. The structures can be 20, 30%. It can be an annual fee, it can be a flat fee per release. So it really varies. And you also want to make sure always when dealing with the U.S. company, if you have Brazilian agreements, you want to make sure that if your Brazilian agreements in Brazil are exclusive, you want to make sure that they're only for this territory and that any agreement in the U.S. is either not exclusive or exclusive for a territory that's carved out of your agreements here. Last thing to talk about quickly, because I know we're running tight on time, but just to quickly talk about a couple different structures for publishing agreements. So there are traditional publishing deals, which, really full publishing deals, you do not see that often anymore. But co-publishing deals are very common. So that's where you're giving up 50% of your publishing, and public performance royalties, you keep 100% usually of the writer's share and 50% of the publisher's share. And then depending on the different revenue streams, you can carve out what those royalties look like and what those splits look like. And the admin deal, I think, is increasingly common, particularly as advance money dwindles and there's an emergence of independent publishing companies. And there are some fantastic Cobalt is a fantastic company that enters into admin deals all the time. And they generally take 5 to 10% administration fee, but then they'll also take a bigger percentage. Yeah?
No, Cobalt sometimes is less.
That's true. It can be less.
Yes.
But they may take a bigger percentage on deals that they bring to the table. So if they procure a license for you, that split will be different.
A sync license.
For sync licenses.
Mm-hmm.
And
there's so much.
There's so much. I went through a lot very quickly, but we can talk more about it later if you have questions.
So I'll just talk about money for a moment. Yes. I love money. Tax-wise, just to let you know, there's no tax treaty. Unfortunately, you may know this already if you've done business with the U.S., but there's no tax treaty between the U.S. and Brazil. And what that means is if you are generating money in the U.S. from a U.S.-based company, they're required by law to withhold 30% at source before they send you your check. So if you see 30% that's been withdrawn, it's usually legitimate. It is what's required for that business in the U.S. under the tax regulations. There are loopholes that people have tried to figure out to get around that. I always say consult a specific tax attorney if you really are looking for the loopholes. There are people who have set up U.S. businesses and then who try to keep the money. If you keep it in the U.S. and you have U.S. activity, enough that you're going to need that money in the U.S., say the next time you come on tour, pay for your hotels or what have you, maybe that would work for you. If you are plan to continue to have activity in the U.S., you could try to look at that option. I'm going to go fast through that. Okay, money in the U.S. So I worked for an organization called Sound Exchange for over 8 years, and they are the equivalent. They are the neighboring rights society in the United States, basically. I don't know if you were at the earlier panel that Hannah did on neighboring rights, but the United States does not have a full public performance right for recording artists and record labels for the use of their sound recordings. They have a limited right, which is for digital, specifically non-interactive digital streaming. But what that means is that a U.S. company can digitally stream any commercially released sound recording that's been released anywhere. And their only requirement is that they report into Sound Exchange and pay a fee that's been set typically by the government. I say typically, there's some exceptions, but been mandated by the government. And what has happened is Sound Exchange has become the largest neighboring rights society in the world because just from this limited right, meaning they don't get to collect from television broadcasts or radio broadcasts or clubs and venues who are playing sound recordings, only from non-interactive, which is random play, not on demand, but random play of music online. They're only allowed to collect that, and yet they've collected and distributed out almost $3 billion to recording artists and record labels, both American and internationally. And everybody, every recording artist and every artist who's their own label, and every label qualifies to collect from Sound Exchange their royalties. And in fact, they are still sitting on a pile of millions of dollars for tens of thousands of artists and independent labels who have not come and collected it. That being said, Sound Exchange does have a reciprocal agreement with UBC here in Brazil, but not the other societies. And so there's a question as to whether every Brazilian artist and label is getting their monies. Now, there is that 30% withholding I talked about, but it's important, I think, for folks to consider, talk to UBC, talk to your other, if you're a member of another society, another neighboring rights society here, to talk to them and see what they're doing. Talk to potentially a royalty, what I call royalty agents, such as Hannah sitting back there, raise your hand, she just did the panel earlier, to understand that there might be monies out there for you, and whether you do it yourself or have someone collect it for you, or go direct to Sound Exchange and just register. They have an online registration form. You may want to just go ahead and register directly with them and start working through the metadata, because Hannah had mentioned there's a lot of issues about whether people are collecting everything that's due to them when their name is not spelled quite right, because the only thing that Sound Exchange pays out on is the playlists that come from the services. And just to give you a little tip, most of the money that Sound Exchange collects, these large big checks and everything, are coming from 3 services. Pandora in the United States, Sirius XM Radio, and iHeartRadio. And most of it is coming from Pandora, I have to say right now. I'm saying it. And if that's the case and you only have so many hours in the day, spend your time making sure that you get lots of plays on Pandora. And you'll get some nice big checks, 30% being withheld, unfortunately. But there are some wonderful independent artists who are independent. Some guy who plays funny, humorous acoustic music who are making $30,000 or $40,000 a year, US dollars, just from their Sound Exchange check, mostly because of Pandora plays with a little bit of Sirius XM radio. So there could be some good income to be had. I mean, you have to make sure all the metadata is correct, and what that particular artist was doing was sending a social media campaign telling every friend and family and follower, start a Pandora channel on me. Now, you don't have Pandora here in Brazil, so you're having to find US fans and friends and followers. You do? No, you don't. So you'd have to find US-based friends and families and followers and tell them, start a Pandora channel. If you love Brazilian music, start a Pandora channel and listen.
And you need to make sure Pandora has your music as well.
Of course.
So you need to make sure that
Distribution.
you either submit it or you're being distributed to Pandora.
Yes. And I'll stop right there, but you can ask questions later, because there's so much.
There's so much.
But we have very little
really
time.
Quickly, can we talk about a couple resources for artists and music companies in the US that have more information for you, or at least are good for you to know when you're traveling in the US or you want to connect with other companies and artists there?
Yeah.
So,
but can I mention one quick thing about
of
revenue?
course.
If you're a session musician, a non-featured artist, you're also permitted to also go collect. And there's actually a separate website, not Sound Exchange, where you go for that. And it's RA Royalties, I can spell it for you later, .org, where you can go, and that's a fund that's set up for the digital streaming royalties for background vocalists and background musicians. And if you found yourself on recordings, you should also be looking at that. There are other special payment funds. Hannah can tell you more about it. ARC, etc. So associations?
Associations, resources.
So in the United States, there are some great organizations, and if you're trying to network, anyway, if you're trying to network in the United States and get to know more people and get involved, look at the Recording Academy, which is the Grammy organization. You are permitted to potentially be a member if you qualify, but as a foreigner, you can join. And look at the Latin Grammy, which is fabulous. And speak to this fabulous woman here. Raise your hand. Speak. The Latin Grammys. And because everyone's welcome to join from other countries, right? I mean, that's how it works, right? So, and then, gosh, there's so many. If you're an independent label, it's important to potentially, of course, well, ABMI here then has a nice relationship with A2IM, which is the independent label organization in the United States.
There's NARM, or the Music Business Association. There's the National Music Publishers Association, NMPA.
AIMP.
And there's AIMP, the Association of Independent Music Publishers. There's Women in Music, which we are president and vice president of, and we have some board members here.
And men can be members.
We have a lot of male members, but we are a nonprofit. We have almost 1,000 members, most of which are in New York, but you can connect with all of our members via a Google group, and we do events and stream them so you can participate in various ways. A couple newsletters or ways to keep up with music industry happenings.
That was really
and
loud.
legal events in the U.S. Digital music news. I subscribe to it. I get it every day. You can follow what's trending there. The Left Set's Letter is a big one.
You said digital music news?
I said digital music news. For independent musicians, the CD Baby DIY Musician blog, I think, is quite excellent. What else is there? I mean,
there's lots of popular communities. Yeah. But you know,
so
yeah,
we're happy to tell you more resources and places to find information on the internet afterward. But let's open it up for some questions, if possible. Gustavo.
Yeah, do you need the mic?
Vou liberar, tá? Mas elas duas estarão aqui todos os dias. Só estou falando isso porque, né, começou um certo barulhinho. E talvez possa ser mais adequado conversar aí afora. Portanto, quantas pessoas desejam fazer perguntas?
Congratulations for both speeches, very, very good.
Thank you.
I'll have two questions. One question is about the copyright. If I want to stream a classic like New York, New York, or My Way, do I have to have a pre-authorization to do so, or can I just pay the rights afterwards? This is the first question. And the second question is, if someone is getting married in the USA and wants me to hire to sing there, do I have to have all this legal procedure of 6 months in front, or I can travel with a tourist visa or business visa?
You do mechanicals and I'll do public.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you want to take it first, or you want me to?
No, you do.
Okay, so to answer your first question, in the U.S., it's very different than Brazil when you want to cover a song. So if a song is written by a U.S. artist, they have to give you, by a U.S. songwriter, they have to give you the license to record it. Unlike in Brazil, where they can say no, where they can negotiate a fee, although I know that there are pre-negotiated percentages for major and indie labels. In the US, it's one flat royalty rate. It's 9.1 cents, assuming the song's a certain duration, but it's 9.1 cents per copy that you make. And they have to give you this license. They're required by law.
It's what they call a compulsory license.
It's called a compulsory mechanical license. They cannot.
If it's a published song.
Yes.
If somebody hasn't published it yet, then you're not allowed to record it until they give you permission.
If they haven't released it yet, if I wrote a song and I showed it to you, but I haven't commercially released it, you need special permission. But if it's already released and you want to cover,
Bruce Springsteen
or Alicia Keys, the example you used, they have to give you the license. Or you can just pay royalties in compliance with the statute. But usually you would want a license directly with them or through the Harry Fox Association, HFA. They have a system called Songfile, which is great for independent artists because it allows you to prepay your royalties. So you can say, I anticipate on selling 1,000 downloads of this song this year. Or they have streaming also, or I want 1,000 streams and I'll pay you in advance. And then it lasts a year, and then you renew in a year or when you expire. Or you can license direct with the publishers. What's very important, though, to keep in mind is that the 9.1 cents covers each copy that you make. It's not, you need to, if you want a license for streaming or other uses, you need to make sure that your license sufficiently covers that. You also may want to carve out certain uses that, like if you're putting it in a music video, I always try to get music videos included in my licenses, or certain promotional or free goods. If you're giving out copies, legally you're supposed to pay royalties on even free copies that you make. So if I am distributing here at the conference 1,000 copies, I have to pay royalties. But often, if you're licensing direct with a publisher, you can negotiate those terms, and they'll, depending on what you're doing, they're usually pretty negotiable about those points.
That's right. There's a compulsory right with the 9.1 cent statutory license, but there is the right to go to the publisher and do a different deal if they'll allow it.
You can always negotiate, and you can negotiate lower rates too, although they're usually reluctant unless...
Sorry, no, yeah, I was going to go. So then your question about can you sing
And the other question
a
is,
song?
you have a marriage, you sing in a marriage,
Right,
USA,
right.
or just you do one single show in a show
Right.
place.
So if it's in a show place, if it's in a hotel, if it's in a restaurant, hopefully the restaurant and the hotel have done a license with the local performance rights organization, which in the United States is ASCAP, BMI, or CSAC, all three. Then really anything that the performer is performing, whether it's an amateur or a professional. Are you talking about the immigration?
You're talking about,
Oh, sorry, talking about licensing, sorry. Okay, so immigration issues, yes, yes. If you're not receiving any pay,
He's receiving pay.
I'm sorry, you are, oh,
He
you
is
got
receiving
hired
pay.
to
He's
do a
being
gig?
hired to sing a wedding.
Oh, yes, you absolutely must have a visa. Absolutely.
To work temporary over there.
Yes,
Yes.
absolutely.
Even if I receive my PayPal, it's impossible. I must have this.
It's not even if you were receiving pay, but you know, actually, if you're doing work, is the wording actually. If you're doing work in the United States, so whether you work for free or not doesn't make a difference. It's whether there is work being done. Yeah, Robert, I know you want to say something. But
The lawyers aren't
Okay,
telling you that, but
but-
as a practice,
Tamistad. Amen. Yeah, I mentioned that earlier. Traffic Control Group and Tamistad. Right. But let me tell you, Robert's saying it, yeah, that's true in this reality-based thing. Look at the business risk. As a business person, artists are business people too, look at the business risk. The business risk is if you do get found, because there are governmental authorities going around looking, and especially at places like South by Southwest, there are. The more it becomes what it is, the more they're looking. It's become more and more international, and it's a hotbed for the government to look. And if you're found out, you were put on that little blacklist, and it's very difficult to ever get a visa ever again to work in the US. So do you want to risk it? Yes, many artists do, and historically, artists absolutely have. But look at where you're performing, and look at the cost-benefit analysis and the risk involved. Yeah,
yes.
we can.
Da reciprocidade. Para eu trazer um artista dos Estados Unidos para cá, qual a diferença do procedimento? Como é que fica?
Okay, translation. Can you translate? Translate.
The reciprocity, he wants to bring an artist to Brazil.
Yeah.
What must he do?
Oh, if you want to bring an American artist to Brazil, so I'm not a
Neither of us are
Brazilian
Brazilian
immigration
attorneys.
attorney, but it is somewhat similar. There are categories here in Brazil, and there has to be a long period of, as I was saying, of pre-planning to make an application, and there has to be a Brazilian sponsor. But outside of that, I don't know. About
There are a
some
lot
of
of
the specifics.
fantastic Brazilian attorneys actually in this room also, so we can connect you. I'm sure they have referrals for immigration attorneys.
Right. There we go.
Any other questions?